It's one of the most chilling and catastrophic air disasters ever. A Boeing 747, carrying 524 people, spirals out of control high above Japan. Inside the cockpit, alarms blare. The crew scrambles to regain control, and terrified passengers frantically write farewell notes. What caused the plane's massive tail to tear off? And could the pilots somehow save the doomed flight before it's too late? This is the harrowing true story of Japan Airlines Flight 123, a fateful flight. On the evening of August 12, 1985, Flight 123 took off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport. The aircraft was packed with 509 passengers and 15 crew members, many of them returning home for the Obon holiday, one of Japan's busiest travel seasons. Little did they know that, on this flight, the aircraft they trusted was hiding a deadly secret. A critical flaw, unnoticed for years, was about to push the plane to the brink of disaster. The crew, at the helm of this Boeing 747, was First Officer Yutaka Sassi, a young, ambitious pilot with nearly 4,000 flight hours. This was his moment to prove he was ready for a captain's role. Sitting beside him was the experienced Captain Masami Takahama, who had over 12,000 hours of flying under his belt. The flight engineer, Hiroshi Fukata, also had nearly 10,000 flight hours, making this a highly skilled crew. But no amount of experience could prepare them for what would come next. The calm before the storm. The flight was smooth at first, with the massive jet climbing steadily over Tokyo Bay. As it reached 24,000 feet, the cabin pressurized, a normal procedure on every flight. Yet, hidden deep within the rear of the plane was a flaw, a damaged bulkhead, the critical structure responsible for holding the cabin pressure. Years before, after a hard landing, this bulkhead had been improperly repaired. With each flight, tiny cracks grew. And now, as Flight 123 cruised over the Pacific, that damage would prove catastrophic. The disaster strikes. Out of nowhere, the plane shook violently. The bulkhead finally gave way, and the pressurized air inside the cabin exploded through the breach, tearing apart the plane's tail. The rudder, the auxiliary power unit, and several key control systems were ripped off, instantly incapacitating the plane's flight controls. Inside the cabin, chaos erupted. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and passengers were left gasping for air. In the cockpit, the crew was stunned. The aircraft's alarms blared, warning that the air was now too thin to breathe. But that was just the beginning. Out of control, with the tail gone and the hydraulics failing, the pilots lost control of the plane. It began banking uncontrollably. No matter what they did, they couldn't level the wings. Worse still, the rudder was gone, leaving the plane swinging wildly like a leaf in the wind, a phenomenon called Dutch roll. On top of that, without hydraulic power, the pilots couldn't control the plane's altitude. The aircraft pitched up, then dropped, gaining speed and climbing again in a terrifying roller coaster motion known as phugoid motion. Passengers screamed, some writing final letters to loved ones as the crew desperately tried to stabilize the plane. The struggle for survival. In the cockpit, the pilots fought against the terrifying instability. First Officer Sassi and Captain Takahama were losing oxygen, their mental faculties beginning to dull, a condition known as hypoxia. Still, they kept fighting because they had to. With all flight controls gone, the pilots realized their only option was to use the engines to control the altitude. By adjusting the throttle at just the right moments, they managed to dampen the violent up and down motion, buying themselves a tiny sliver of hope. A desperate attempt to land. Tokyo Air Traffic Control scrambled to help, but the pilots' communication became sparse. Their oxygen levels were dangerously low, and their decision-making abilities were severely impaired. The situation was dire. They couldn't even descend to a safe altitude. It was clear they were going to need help from the ground. At one point, the flight engineer relayed that a door at the back of the plane had possibly been ripped off, though this was later proven to be a misunderstanding. But with the situation rapidly deteriorating, the pilots focused on one goal: get back to the nearest airport, any airport, before it was too late. A tenuous hope. The crew's only hope lay in one final, desperate move: lowering the landing gear. By extending it, they could slow the aircraft and help bring it down. But there was a problem. The plane refused to descend. For what seemed like an eternity, they remained trapped in a terrifying cycle of climbing and falling. They were still thousands of feet in the air, tantalizingly close to Tokyo, yet impossibly far from safety. A tragic end. After more than 30 minutes of desperate attempts to control the crippled plane, the pilots finally faced the unthinkable. Despite their heroic efforts, the damage was too great. The plane crashed into the mountains near Mount Osataka. Of the 524 people on board, only 4 survived. The aftermath. The investigation revealed the horrifying truth. The plane's tail had been torn off due to a faulty repair years earlier. The accident could have been prevented. The tragedy sparked major changes in aircraft, lessons learned and lasting impact. In the aftermath of the crash, major changes were made to improve aviation safety. Boeing redesigned the tail of the 747 to prevent similar pressure failures. Japan Airlines overhauled their maintenance protocols, and stricter safety regulations were implemented across the industry. Japan Airlines' reputation took a massive hit, with bookings plummeting by over 30% in the weeks following the disaster. The crash of Flight 123 remains the deadliest single aircraft accident in history and one of the darkest days in aviation. But despite the terrible loss, the crash led to critical changes in aviation safety standards, ensuring that lessons learned from this tragedy would save countless lives in the future. Thank you for watching.